This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
Hello, Christopher.
Hey, what's going on?
Just stressing about your house on your behalf.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So much fun. You have a moment of joy where you're like, hey, we passed the inspection, no major issues or whatever. And then the guy shows up today with the mirrors. 2 of them are broken so far out of whatever, and just all kinds of little things like that. It'll be done eventually, but even though that paper says you're approved to move in, it really doesn't feel like you're ready to move in yet. So yeah, it's getting there, but we'll be waiting until even August or September for our refrigerator because of shortages and everything. Jeez. So we have this beautiful little temporary loaner fridge that the company gave us. It's too short for the space and everything. It looks kind of stupid in there, but it's required for like closing and whatever. And just living in general, you pretty much need a refrigerator at home. So yeah, we'll get there. But I think a week from tomorrow, we'll be moving in. And I'm going to go set up all the access points and internet around the house and cameras and everything else. So that is all done. But yeah, lots of like paint touch-ups and other stuff that still has to get done. Yeah, but
so we will miss seeing you in your house by literally a couple of days because we'll be there this next week and we leave Saturday.
Yeah, you'll definitely get to see it. And we're going to have to probably stop randomly a couple times out there because the blinds are getting installed one day and I forget what else another day. There will be several visits to the house, I'm sure.
During your backup. If something's going wrong, I'll be your muscle. I have
you
muscle,
just need to,
but I'll be the intimidation.
Yeah, just stand directly behind me, just arms crossed, and that's all you need.
Just gonna wear a suit the whole time in St. Louis and prep.
Yeah.
You said you had broken mirrors?
I mean, they came that way. So whose bad luck is it though? Because it arrived that way. So is it their bad luck or ours?
I mean, you told me a story about your neighbor's house exploding. So,
well, that wasn't a neighbor. That was like in a neighborhood 15 minutes away, but pretty close. Oh. So the story is, for anybody who wants to know, the fiber internet companies are hiring contractors to go dig and bury fiber internet to all these houses. They've been apparently just hitting natural gas pipelines, and they had cleared out. This has happened, I think, twice in the last few months. They cleared out the house because they knew they had struck the line, but the house explodes and it's just there 1 second, basically gone, except for the foundation, the next, and like the house next door that is 10, 15, 20 feet away, the entire side of that house is pitch black because of all the soot and everything. It was so scary to see. Nobody got hurt, but fiber internet is unsafe. That's what I've learned.
That's my takeaway. I'm just going to stick with Comcast for the rest of my life. Like my trusty coax cable.
Exactly. And what like satellite internet has ever exploded anything. So there you go.
Wow. Oh me. Well, it's exciting though. It's only been a quick 2 years to build a house.
Facebook's like 1 year ago, they were like putting up the forms for the foundation. And I'm like, oh boy, it's already been over a year now of building. And then it was like 9 months of designing and stuff. And I don't know, there's something fun about all this where it's like you can draw these like comparisons to software development. You can imagine that it works very similarly, but then there's so many rules and other things. Or imagine you have a crew that comes in and just builds authentication in your Rails app. And then they leave and some other crew comes in and does the database modeling and somebody else comes in and does the views and controllers. It's like such a weird way that homes get built because these crews are experts in areas, but they don't like to work with each other and whatnot and all kinds of stuff like that. But you have so many rules and other things that thank God we don't quite have in software, but also sometimes you're like, they have a nice sort of organized way of, they build so many homes and it's got a kind of the same process, which is kind of cool. And you're like, that would be kind of interesting if software ever had a set process where you could just kind of plan it out. But I think typically homes are all pretty much the same thing at the end of the day. For the most part, the structure of them are all the same, but the structure of your software is going to be vastly different depending on what you're doing. So some of those I don't think are quite comparable, but the whole time I've been like, this is really interesting to see like a parallel thing happening. And you can imagine how you would plan a software project, or as a software developer plan to build a house or whatever. So it's been fun.
Is that what Agile is?
It's all waterfalls in home building.
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting. I've never thought of it in those terms because, yeah, like everyone who comes to my house to like work on stuff is a specialist, right? Like they're working on a very like concentrated thing. And at the same time, though, if something goes wrong, it's easy to point that at the other specialized team. It's interesting. Well, I guess maybe not the next one, but the time after this, hopefully you'll be recording in your...
Yeah, I was in the office earlier today. Yeah, the hardwood floors and nothing on the walls and no furniture is like super echoey. So I'm going to have to do some work and make sure that it's a little bit better for sound when we're podcasting and screencasting and casting, fly fishing.
Chrome casting. I bought the curtains in my office. They're not necessarily like specialty curtains, but I did look for curtains that were rated, like where people are like, oh, I actually like record in my office. And that's why I put a rug down. If it was up to me, I would not have a rug in my office. But when I was recording the stimulus reflex course, it was just like bouncing off every wall. I was about to buy like paneling and stuff. And Shannon's like, you need to like chill the hell out and like try some of these other things.
Yeah. We're using this microphone, the Shure one at the time.
The Shure microphone is because of the reflex course. So I had that Yeti that we recorded 100 remote rubies with, and it didn't do a very good job of isolating sound. And getting this alone was good enough to improve things, but the curtains and the rug and stuff were just, that's when I started trying to be a perfectionist. I have special things. I don't know what you call it. I have a special strip inside my doors when it closes, like my kids screaming doesn't come in as much, stuff like that. So
yeah, we have one of those, but not for the same purpose. It's because the dog will bark at the cat through the bottom of the door, and the cat's got his paw through. And so we have one of those strips at the bottom of the door just to separate them so they can't see each other.
That's smart. I imagine if I didn't have the thing on the bottom of my door, I would see like little fingers like pushing their way through the door. So,
yeah, probably. So anyways.
That's good. I like it. Well, we are Andrew-less today. Shout out Andrew, who I know will listen to this because he listens to every episode. He is moving and hanging out with Mom, and I hope it's going well, Andrew. But it is Andrew's loss today because we have a special guest we've been looking forward to for a while now. So today we have Ufuk from Shopify. He is the engineering manager for the Ruby. I forgot the exact thing. It's the Ruby infrastructure. Infrastructure.
Okay. Yes. Infrastructure. Yes.
I was going to say Ruby experience because it is kind of like that. Y'all are doing things that do improve the Ruby experience, but we are very grateful for you joining us today.
Thank you. I'm grateful to be here.
So obviously a whole range of topics to talk about. Maybe very briefly, something we do like to ask folks when they come on is just how they got into programming, specifically Ruby. And as someone managing this team, I think it'd be really cool to kind of hear how you got here.
So my path to software and to Ruby has been all over the place. I had a special affinity to computers when I was a small child. So I did some programming at high school. We had some lessons and everything. But then I was really passionate about physics and math. So I studied physics. I did a PhD in physics, and I was going to be a scientist, but then I kind of fell out of love with that. So while I was doing my PhD, I rediscovered my love for programming and just started teaching myself web programming, PHP 3 at the time, and then some desktop programming with Delphi, Turbo Pascal, whatever, all those things. And I had a high school friend who was working as a programmer. So he was like helping me get up to speed. And then I ended up getting a job when I was helping him out with something. And then I ended up being in a startup for about 10 years, working on voice technologies. And then I left there and we formed a startup accelerator with my boss there, who then became my partner, business partner. And we did like startup acceleration for about 3 years. And I was the CTO managing partner there. And that was where I discovered Ruby and Ruby on Rails. So we were helping a solo founder get her project off the ground. And we wanted to support her because we thought the idea was nice and she could execute on it. She just didn't have a technical co-founder. So I was like, we can build it. And I was interested in learning about Ruby on Rails. So I thought, what better opportunity to teach myself something new as I'm building this. And it needs to be built really quickly. It needs a fast time to market. So I taught myself that and built it using that. And then we did a few more things. And then I realized I wanted to do software development full time. So moved to another web agency working on a product, and then finally landed at Shopify on the Ruby and Rails infrastructure team as a senior developer first, working on gradual types adoption and everything, and then decided to move into management and became the manager of the Ruby infrastructure team.
That's such a cool story. So when you joined Shopify, you were actually hopped in writing code.
Yes.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I was employed as a senior developer. Yep.
Okay. Were you already on the infrastructure team as a developer?
Yes. So the job I applied to was one that was put out by Raphael France. He was like building his team out. Actually, the other day it was his 7th year at the company and he was celebrating it online. And he was talking about how he built the whole Ruby and Rails infrastructure team from one person himself to about 50 people now. And I was like the 4th person in that journey. So I applied to that job post, and I think he was trying to recruit people to oversee the sorbet adoption at the time. And I ended up being on that team. We did the sorbet adoption. We built it out. And then, I decided to try my hand at management, and I've been enjoying it so far.
That's great. When you became manager, how large was the team?
Oh, that was an interesting experience. We were actually having conversations with Raphael if like I wanted to go to management track or the IC track. And I was ambivalent about that. And then finally, when I decided and told him that, let's do this. And then we were trying to divide the team of 6 people at the time, maybe. But it was obviously like some people were very involved with Rails and the others were like Sorbet and Ruby. So I said, I can't possibly really lead a Rails team when you're here as a lead. So maybe I should do the Ruby side. So I had initially 2 reports, Alan Wu and Alexander Teresa. And Alan was working on C Ruby stuff and Alex was working on Sorbet, and I was contributing mostly to the Sorbet side on the side as well. And so, we grew from that 2-person team to about 17, 18 people now on just the Ruby infrastructure side.
Wow, that's awesome. How has the growth of that team been for you? Like, did you have to learn a lot of management stuff along the way? Has it been interesting, like tough?
Oh yeah, it's been a lot because I've done a lot of different kinds of programming throughout my career. I've done C, C++, etc., this and that, but I haven't been really like very deep on any of those things. And mostly that was to develop a product. So I've never really been involved in language design or programming languages or how like VMs work. To begin with, it's been like a huge technical challenge for me to get up to speed with what's going on and what people are talking about. When you're in a room, people are talking about different programming language optimization techniques, not even the language itself, but like, oh, we can apply this technique and then that technique and do constant folding and we can get more performance. And I'm like, what are you exactly talking about? So there was a lot of technical learning there. But obviously, I had done some management in my career, but it was very lonely. So I had to do a lot of learning on the management side, obviously, as well. But Raphael has been super supportive to get me up to speed initially. And then Mike became my lead, and he's been amazing in showing me the ropes and showing me how to be a better manager. I'm following in great people's footsteps. So it's been very instructive for me.
So the Ruby infrastructure team, we've talked about like Rails and Ruby. Would you mind maybe just giving us an overview of kind of all the, you don't necessarily have to go into every specific, but just kind of a high level overview of what all your team encompasses in terms
Sure. So actually, we try to be a little bit agile with our teams. We try to have project teams instead of like very long living teams. Right now, the main project teams that we have under the Ruby infrastructure arm of our team is Truffle Ruby, YJIT, the C Ruby team that's working exclusively on making C Ruby improvements and performance improvements, and the Ruby developer experience team. So that's probably why you were thinking it was the Ruby experience, because Ruby developer experience is a part of the Ruby infrastructure team. So those four main areas are the areas we look at. So Truffle Ruby is our long-term bet because it's an alternative implementation of Ruby. So it's not encumbered by any of the historic things that Ruby has in its code base. So it's like a greenfield implementation, which comes with its own problems because it needs to be perfectly compatible with Ruby. But at the same time, they can do a lot of different optimizations. They can aim for peak performance and they have full control over their stack. And they can try different optimization techniques on that code base. So we're both seeing that as a long-term bet for what Ruby can be for peak performance. And we're trying to run it in production and getting kind of promising results there as well. But also learning about some of the optimization techniques that were implemented in Truffle Ruby and seeing how we can do technology transfer from there to inside C Ruby. Object shapes, for example, being one of them that Gemma on my team and Aaron and Eileen are working on. And they're almost finished implementing that inside C Ruby. That was a technology that was already implemented in Truffle Ruby. And we heard from Chris how like it was implemented and it was working really well. So Truffle Ruby is that long-term bet. YJIT is the short-term bet. It's how can we do the simplest thing? How can we build the simplest JIT that can give us speed improvements inside of C Ruby so that we don't have to implement something new? And we can be very compatible and we can be gradual about this, right? We don't have to implement JITting for all of the instructions inside C Ruby. We can do it as necessary or just in time. So YJIT is that really short-term bet. How can we get immediate speed improvements? The C Ruby team, their concentration is how can we improve Ruby as a language and the C Ruby implementation itself. So how can we improve the garbage collection? How can we improve the object memory layout and all those things? And then the developer experience team grew out of what we call the Ruby types team. So initially I was a part of that. That team's mandate was doing gradual types adoption on our core monolith and then building tooling around that. And now we realize that gradual types adoption is actually doing static analysis on our code base in a smart way, because when you have type information, it becomes easier to do static analysis. And then it becomes really powerful because you can build great developer tooling on top of that. So go to definition, go to references, or hover over a method and see its documentation and line in your editor, or auto-completion. All those things become, I shouldn't say super easy, become relatively easy when you have the static type information. So we realized there was more things we could do for developer tooling, even without sorbet, even without the type information. So you can do, for example, inline linting. So there's no reason why you can't run Rubocop in memory to give you all the linting errors and then show them inside the editor. And then when you save your file to auto-format it as to what Rubocop would have auto-corrected it. So that was the first thing I prototyped in one of the hack days, and that was working as Rubocop LSP. And then we took that feature and some other LSP things, and the team is now building Ruby LSP that's now like at 0.1 release or something. We're still testing out a few different things, especially we're testing it out with Shopify internal developers because there are first customers. I think we'll talk about customers and how we develop product in a minute as well. But we want to make sure we give Shopify developers the best experience first because we're closest to them. We can talk to them directly. So they're our first customers. Our vision right now isn't to make this super usable for the whole community, though we're developing it in the open. We want to make sure that if it's usable by Shopify developers, then we're going to go back to the drawing board and see how we can make it more usable more broadly as well.
That's amazing. we've talked to Chris Seaton before. I mean, it's been a couple of years. He was still, I think, with Oracle when we talked to him on the show.
Right.
I was interested in that you were saying that Truffle Ruby is kind of the long-term bet for Shopify. Do you have any production services running Truffle Ruby?
Not right now. We're close to that. We could get production workloads running on Truffle Ruby. The trade-off Truffle Ruby has done is to optimize peak performance at the cost of boot time. So it takes a long time to warm up. That's getting better. There's improvements in that area, but we deploy too frequently. So by the time Truffle Ruby warms up and becomes performant, we end up deploying the code base again, and then that takes us back to square zero. So it can run production workloads. It's just not very compatible with the way we deploy things. So the team's now looking, along with Oracle, how to make the boot time, the warm-up time faster. And there's been a lot of progress there. They've actually halved it, and then we'll probably have more progress. So hopefully pretty soon we'll actually have some production workload running on Truffle Ruby.
That's really cool. Hi, my name is Andrew Mason, and I'd like to tell you about Honeybadger. Whether US East 1 is down or you forget to add a configuration file, everyone has an outage from time to time. When your next outage occurs, transparency is critical. The difference between a minor annoyance that people soon forget and a fiasco that creates sustained resentment is how you communicate. That's why you need Honeybadger. Honeybadger is a crucial component of your incident response plan with their uptime monitoring service that now has an exciting new feature, public status pages. Create a new status page with custom domains, branding, and more. Don't let Twitter be the only way your users can find out if your app's down. Sign up for Honeybadger to improve your incident response with a shiny new status page that you'll be proud to show users. Visit honeybadger.io and start giving your users a better experience today. Let them know that Remote Ruby, and specifically Andrew Mason, sent you. A question I have, like you were saying that some of the Truffle Ruby stuff, you found that, maybe we could try and implement just some of these like gains in C Ruby. And then I was thinking about like the developer experience team. They're building tools, as you said, like first to help your developers in Shopify. With Truffle Ruby, it's okay if you don't know the answer to this. With Truffle Ruby, if that becomes the Ruby implementation at Shopify, are you able to still use the tooling you've built for developer experience and apply it to Truffle Ruby?
We should be able to. We should be able to use most of it. The current Ruby LSP is built on Syntax Tree, which is Kevin Newton's project, which itself is built on Ripper. I'm not exactly sure if Truffle Ruby has Ripper. I doubt it does because it has a different way of representing its AST. So you caught my lack of knowledge there. But
that's
yes,
okay. That's okay.
I guess that wouldn't work, but we could probably replace that with some other thing that works on top of the Truffle Ruby. So it's kind of pluggable. We can work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at that point, if you're about to make a switch to Truffle Ruby, you have the resources to be able to make other things happen. It's just a fascinating thing I haven't thought about before because I haven't really worked with many Ruby implementations outside of C Ruby, or I guess the Matt's Ruby
implementation.
Yeah.
Emerald.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, probably the last thing I ever used was like the Ruby Enterprise Edition, which probably stopped it. I don't even remember.
It stopped it. I can tell you when. Because we ran it at my last job on an old app. It was 187, and we had a patched version of it. We kept patching.
Yeah. I can't remember what happened. Like Rubinius and some of the other implementations kind of fell off, and JRuby's still going. Yes. But as far as I know, mostly it's C Ruby, JRuby, and Truffle Ruby are the kind of main three ones going on right now.
That's my understanding as well. I also don't want to give the impression that Shopify is going to switch to Truffle Ruby completely because we honestly don't have any plans of doing that soon. But there are some workloads inside Shopify that need peak performance so that we can respond to our user requests as fast as possible. And in those cases, it might make more sense to use something that runs way faster than whatever else we have. So it's like a portfolio of different tools that are available to us. So I don't want this to sound like I'm going to drop C Ruby anytime soon and switch to Truffle Ruby. That's not the plan.
Sure. The thing that's nice about it, though, is for those workloads, you can bring developers who just know Ruby which you already have a ton of. And that's amazing. You're not asking them to like go learn Go. Your team is probably asking people to learn Rust for YJIT. But outside of that, writing Ruby. So that's really cool. I love that.
Yeah, for YJIT now, Rust is a requirement, yes.
Something I wanted to ask you about, I know earlier you mentioned specifically going and organizing things as project teams instead of like long-term teams. I was just curious about that decision and how that works, benefits to that.
So there's pros and cons again, like with everything. It's all trade-offs. I think the biggest benefit is you don't box people in. And we've seen a lot of that happening where people want to contribute to other projects or they want to work on other things. And then they don't need to ask for permission as long as they have some slack in their current work or their team can let them go for a while or something, even as they're working on like another project. We allow them to work on other projects and other problems as well. And ultimately, if they want to do the switch full time, we're very open to that. It shouldn't be a thing to change teams. And that gives both the people who are working on the team more flexibility and more options. And also makes it easier for management. Like we don't have to think about the micro decisions of, oh, well, you're just a C Ruby developer. You can't possibly work on Truffle Ruby. It's silly at that scale.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It just caught my attention because I think the bigger a company gets, the more specialized a lot of people become. And I think it's pretty easy to have that tendency of, yeah, you're the C Ruby developer and that's all you can ever do. And you don't want to lose those people because if they get tired of that or want to do something new, you don't want them to go leave for another company. You want to be able to provide that opportunity internally. And that's awesome.
Exactly. The downside is though, people are usually very tribal and they want to feel like they belong to a long running team. If you go to them and say, well, this team doesn't exist anymore, then people feel threatened or like, what do you mean? What's happening to me or something? So we're trying to balance that, obviously, so that it's not shocking to anyone if teams change composition or if we change direction for what we're working on.
Speaking of what you're working on, most of my professional experience has been like on product teams. I am building features to help X business, and it's typically not like I'm working on making code better for other developers. So I am a little curious to hear more about what your team decides to work on. Like when they want to improve X performance, is that because they've just experienced that on their own? They've heard other people in the company talk about it? Like where do some of these projects come from?
First of all, I want to say I've always worked on product teams throughout my career as well. So I'm very close to that. So the way we do road mapping and prioritization is it might be a little bit different because this is a team of very deep domain experts. They really know the problems that are waiting. So we have a lot of trust for the direction that they feel like we should go in. And we basically sit down, have conversations, brainstorm, and talk about ideas. But generally what happens is we can kind of see the trends of where the language wants to go, where it's going to evolve. And sometimes we want to experiment with an idea. YJIT was a small experiment with an idea, actually. It started off as like a very small JIT. It was actually called MicroJIT originally, not YJIT, right?
Respect.
And it was like, can we even build this? And then once we realized we can build it and it does give us like good performance numbers, then we doubled down on it and continued investing in it. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question really well, but really we just look at like where other languages are going, where Mats wants to take Ruby, where the Ruby core team wants to take Ruby. What are some of the present problems that Shopify has? And then how can we help that? So the biggest problem Shopify has is how can we serve our web pages faster? Building a JIT it made a lot of sense. So if you can de-risk that, if you can do like a prototype and then validate that, and then if you can validate it, then continue investing in it, then you can fail fast. So you can make a small investment, see what works, what doesn't. You can take learnings from it and then try something else. So to complete the answer to your question is we usually like every 6 months or something, we sit down, kind of do like a road mapping exercise. We list out all of the things we could be working on, some of them being super aspirational. And then we kind of do an effort impact assessment. Is this high effort, low impact, or is it low effort, high impact? The latter is obviously better. And then we kind of do like a prioritization based on that. And then that kind of bubbles up a few things that we should be looking at next. And then we form teams around that and start working.
That absolutely answered my question. And one thing that you said that was like a very satisfying answer to it is everyone on that team is like a domain expert. And so the first thing that came to my mind is like someone like Aaron Patterson, who just knows the ins and outs of Ruby. He's going to know where the pain points are, the things that need to be improved. And so, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of hopping back on something you said earlier, we kind of talked about this at RailsConf a little bit. So you were talking about how the fail fast, prototype it. I believe at RailsConf you said some of those ideas came from your experience in the startup accelerator, things like that, like learning about lean startup. I'm curious if you've been able to take any of those principles and kind of apply them to this team.
Oh, for sure. So one thing I didn't say in my previous answer is I've always worked on product teams and I still have a product mindset. And I try to tell the teams that I work with that we're also developing a product. It's just the nature of the product is different and the customer, the user of the product is different. Because if you think about it, Ruby is a product people download and use in their machines. It's just programmers that use them and not people clicking on web pages. So the nature of the product is different. Your stakeholders are different. Our stakeholders are Ruby core and the open source community and not just Shopify. But apart from those differences, we're also product teams. So I try to bring as much of the product development methodologies that I saw working in action with the lean methodology. And I keep talking about the build, measure, learn loops, where the idea is you want to validate an idea, not even a product. You want to validate that something could work and you build the smallest thing you can build. And then you measure that in close to real life conditions. And then through that measurement, you take some learnings, your learnings, which you can apply to building the next version of it. And if you can do this build, measure, learn loop as tightly as possible, you can then do like a lot of iterations through that. And that becomes the real agile way of developing product, because agile is how we do the development, how we do the coding, and then lean is how we build the product. I think those are two complementary things. Agile works really well with a lean methodology of doing that build, measure, learn loop many times over. And that's why I try to give the sense that what is the cheapest thing we can do? What is the cheapest thing we can build? For example, as we're developing object shapes, how can we test this like really fast? Maybe it's not the perfect object shapes implementation, but is there like a quick and dirty object shapes implementation that we can put in place in a really short time that can give us a feel of, oh, this is going somewhere, or no, like, let's not push on this any further. So once you have that, then you can improve the implementation, make it work better, and then do a few more loops around that. Obviously, when you're working on a programming language, it becomes hard to measure because it becomes hard to put it in the hand of your users, because we only have major releases once a year and we don't want to wait a whole year to put it in the hands of our users. So we kind of dog food it ourselves, I guess, or do benchmarking or figure out of how we can convince upstream or the maintainers to accept this feature, because we're going to propose a feature upstream and we need to think about how we're going to convince upstream that this feature is actually going to be beneficial and it will be easy to maintain. So that's also a way of interacting with your stakeholders, your users in a way. And thinking through those things means you need to do benchmarking. You need to show that like you're not degrading any performance. And then that becomes your measurement, not in the hands of your users, but in like benchmarks or different, or running it on some of our production workloads or running it on our CI, which is running hundreds of thousands of tests. And then it almost shows any problem you have. It almost always shows up there. So how can we do that faster is what I'm always working on with my teams.
Yeah, because like when you think about it, I mean, it's hard enough to make changes to a gem, but if you are making changes to Ruby itself, like the JIT, you need to make sure that that's going to work in every possible situation. And like, you're talking about a programming language that can be used in an infinite amount of ways. So it's a really valuable thing, I think, to take that approach so that you can say, look, we're being as thorough as we possibly can here and trying to make sure that we're not going to break anything. It's going to actually provide some value and not waste all that time as well. Like if you went and built it all and then missed something important, and then they came back to you and said, no, we can't accept that because of these reasons, then it would be a huge waste of time and money. So I think that approach sounds awesome. How does that work for something like Truffle Ruby that is going to be a very long-term project that maybe you can't necessarily, for example, run your production workloads quite yet? The boot time is the trade-off or whatever. Like some of those can be, I guess, harder to have those iterations maybe, or do you change the way you measure things or whatever?
Of course, the timelines there are definitely longer. And then the measurements become, like how fast are we able to warm up? Then collect a lot of data on benchmarks. So you don't have to like wait for warm up to happen if it's happening too long. So yeah, you need to change how you do measurements. But maybe it's more instructive for me to talk about how we applied this build, measure, learn loop to how we did gradual types adoption instead of that long running project. So when we first started doing the types adoption with Sorbet on our code base, we did have to build a lot of tooling because we knew the tooling we had at the time weren't going to take us all the way there, even to the basic level of adoption, because when we started doing the adoption, Sorbet wasn't actually open source or released yet. We were one of the early adopters. We're probably the biggest code base to adopt Sorbet so early after Stripe. And a lot of the tooling was missing because Stripe, they were working with some of their own internal tooling. So we had to build a lot of tooling. So that part was fine. But as soon as we built that and we're able to let some of the teams that are working on our core monolith able to use this, we did a few different things. One, we started measuring our adoption rate in a dashboard. So that was our way of seeing if this is going up or going down. If people are adding new files with type true or adding new signatures, or they're removing the ones that are already there. Do they hate it or do they like it? But that's still like a indirect signal. One of the other things we did was some teams were really enthusiastic about Sorbet, or they were really curious about it, if not necessarily enthusiastic. So some of the teams had early exposure to Sorbet and they were like early adopters of it. So we arranged one-on-one interviews with them online to ask them questions of what were you expecting from Sorbet and in what ways was it able to match those expectations? What do you think is missing? What do you think is good about this? And not leading questions, but we were trying to understand what are some of the pain points, what are some of the things they liked or didn't like. And this is like for early adopters, and they gave us a lot of feedback. And then next step, we built a small experiment because we realized that our core monolith is arguably the biggest Rails code base in the world. And that's like very noisy. And we weren't getting a lot of signals from that. So we thought we have our own tool, internal tool called dev that runs on every developer's machine. So you run like dev up and then it brings up a project and it does like a lot of different project management related tools. But it's a CLI tool that runs on every developer's machine at Shopify. So we thought it's a small code base. It's very opinionated. What if we typed a significant domain inside that dev tool ourselves? And then we looked at the production numbers of the dev tool and how we were able to affect some of the errors in production. So we did that. That was like a couple of months trying to figure out how the types were flowing through the code base. We need to change some code, etc. So we did type a portion of that code base. And then we realized we were able to eliminate certain classes of errors completely in production. For example, we never had any name errors because all the names are resolved statically. And we were able to reduce no method errors because Sorbet could check most of the method calls statically. And the remaining ones were only coming from places where they were like untyped or where they were interfacing with the rest of the code base that was not typed. So we actually got like really hard results on a small experiment, right? That was the experiment we built. It wasn't the real thing. It was a thing we could test sorbet adoption on. And then we measured it and we got learnings from it. At the same time, we started sending out regular surveys to all of our developers. Every 6 months, we sent out the same survey and we've been measuring the answers people have given to that. And that's very insightful because we can see after 2 or 3 years that there's clear trends in how people are viewing sorbet because we keep asking, is sorbet hard to use? And then people initially, they were saying, yes, it's very hard to use. And now there's less people are saying it's hard to use. We're obviously not at 100% saying it's very easy to use, but we can see those trends and we can do point checks and see if we're on the right track. And then we can course correct as soon as possible and minimize waste and fail fast and all those things. So those are some of the ways in which we try to adopt that lean methodology in the way we're developing product. And I think it's been working really well for us.
One example of something that I was really kind of blown away by, you talked about a little bit earlier, when you think about a project and how you're going to kind of, for lack of a better phrase, kind of sell it upstream.
Yes.
And I think YJIT was like a case study in how to do that, because I remember reading the first proposal for that in the Ruby tracker, and it was very well written and it was very compelling. And it wasn't like, this is just a hand wavy idea. It was, like you said, you're trying to fail fast, you're trying to prove it. And so you had proof that we can do this and we can actually make it, like you came with a proposal, the team came with a proposal, we can actually even add this to Ruby as something you can opt into. Even the proposal to then come back and be like, hey, I think we're going to try and do this in Rust. It was, I don't know. I just want to compliment your entire team on that because it was very compelling.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And part of the reason why we felt comfortable proposing it upstream was the fact that we had a lot of benchmarks we built. So we have this YJIT bench, and then we have this runner that's running YJIT bench daily against the latest YJIT. And we could, similar to what I was talking about with Sorbet, we have a dashboard that's public. You go to speed.ygit.org and you can see our dashboard, and you can see we have some micro benchmarks that are explicitly trying particular things we know YJIT should be speeding up, but they're not representative of real life workloads. And then we have some macro benchmarks that are representative of real life workloads. And we could see that we were getting to a place where we could run Rails bench faster or run like a lot of interesting things faster. And the goal for this team that comes down from Raphael is we want to not just speed up Ruby, we want to speed up Rails, because Rails is our workload at Shopify, right? Like just speeding up Ruby alone isn't enough. We need to make sure that we can speed up our Rails workloads. Once we could see that we could speed up Rails workloads on our benchmarks as well, and that we were stable and we didn't have any stability problems, and we implemented enough instructions to be JITted, we felt comfortable proposing that upstream because we'd already gone through all the exercise of what do we need to implement for this to be usable and functional.
I love this. I've never seen this dashboard before, but I pulled it up and all the YJIT benchmarks are higher than every other benchmark. And that includes Rails bench and some active record things. And like you said, there's a lot of talk about, I guess we'd call MJIT, like just JIT for Ruby.
Yes.
And I remember when it came out, officially it was like, but it doesn't really speed up Rails. And I appreciate MJIT. It's a little hard for me because my entire workflow right now is in Rails. So it's like, this is cool. I can't get real excited about this. So seeing something like this that applies to Rails, something that I write every day and that basically you can adopt for free and just get faster code is exciting. I will never turn that down.
Yes. But I should say, it's not exactly free. We're trying to make it a little bit more free right now.
Sure.
So that's our goal for 3.2. The cost comes at memory overhead. I want to be realistic about that. Right now, as YJIT is released with 3.1, from the get-go, it allocates 256 megabytes of memory because JITted code needs to live somewhere. So it uses that memory buffer to store it. So that might be a little bit too much for some applications. but we're doing major work to make sure that the memory overhead for the next release of YJIT with 3.2 is going to be way less.
That's amazing. I'm excited just about YJIT existing, and y'all are already like, here's how we're going to make it better. I tweeted, I don't know, 6 months, a year ago about how excited I was about all the things coming out of Shopify. And what I didn't know at the time is all the things were coming out of your team. And there's a lot, I think, as Ruby developers, we should be grateful for from Shopify.
Absolutely. I think one of the cool things on the speed.ygit.org is the history, where you can see you're testing all these things and you see some things get worse, some things get better. And it's awesome to see the history of all of that. And that's really going to your point of let's measure things. Let's keep an eye on what we're doing, if they're benefiting or not. And maybe one optimization that you tried 3 months ago that you kept is actually in conflict of something you do 3 months later. And you're like, oh, interesting. We now have data to actually just not be guessing and throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping that those things will work. So it's really cool to see all of this stuff, because that is a very, very thorough approach to doing something like this, which is a massive, massive undertaking. I think just all of these projects are very large. So the amount of work that y'all are cranking out is tremendous. So yeah, like Jason said, thanks for all of this stuff. It's so cool to see.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we're happy that we can do it.
Throwing spaghetti at the wall, that's like the PG version. I've never heard that phrase before. I've only heard the more explicit one that I use every 10 minutes. Well, Ufuk, we're very appreciative of your time and coming on to join us today. Before we wrap up, I want to give you two opportunities. One, if there's anything we didn't cover that you want to talk about, we'd love to talk about that. And also maybe just where some people can find you online.
Oh, sure. I think we covered almost all of the things we wanted to talk about. Where people can find me online is probably on Twitter. My handle is Paracycle, and I've put together a personal website, ufuk.dev as well. And that's got like more links to some of the talks I've given or some of the podcasts I've been on, all the socials people can find me at. So you can take a look at those.
Very awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us. Chris, I will see you in person in 3 days.
Yeah, 3 days. That's right.
And I just saw you 5 days ago. So
I know, it's wild.
It's a big year for us.
And RailsConf before that, like, it is nuts. So you better not give me COVID.
I think you just, never mind. Goodbye.
Jinx it.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.